Hello, good afternoon and good morning to those of you that have joined us from overseas. Joe's just sorting out good old technical stuff. Joe is just offline. Joe, are you there? She is, right.
Else, the fingers crossed. Hopefully
Right.
it'll all come together.
Okay, so it's great for you all to join us today. We have Lee McIntyre Hamilton and Joe Marshall, where we're going to have our monthly update. I don't think we had one last month, did we? I don't think we got there. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot to talk about today. Before we start, it'd be great to hear where everyone's from. That's the geeky side of me. So if you can just let us know where you've joined us today. Lee and Joe, are you good?
All good,
yeah.
yes, all good.
So who's starting today? Is it you, Joe, or Lee?
It's Lee today, but I'm going to do the next slide.
That's fine.
So can you share your screen then?
Certainly can. So hopefully you can see the slides there, Mel, if you just want to give me a heads up. All good?
Yeah, got it.
Right, I'm going to remove myself then.
Yeah, if you just put the slides into present mode, I think, Joe.
Yeah, so hopefully they're there. Can you see them, Lee?
Yes, I can.
Perfect, lovely.
But they're just not on present mode, though.
You just need to put on present, yeah.
Fair enough. See if this will do it. Do you know, honestly, technology, it's great when it works, isn't it?
Don't worry, I'll crack on with my bit anyway whilst you're... technology sometimes gets the better, doesn't it?
Is it any better?
No. But I think we can see it for the moment. So is that all right, Lee? You happy with that?
Yeah, let's crack on.
Okay.
So for those overseas who are dialing in, you may be aware we have an election on in the UK, and those in the UK have obviously will certainly be aware with the election frenzy. I think from an employer perspective, certainly a payroll perspective, there is hopefully not going to be too much change by judging of the manifestos. At the moment, as you'll all know, it seems highly likely that Labour are going to win, and they have essentially are not going to touch the tax and NIC rates, and indeed are going to maintain, it looks like, the current freeze on thresholds through to 2028 that the Conservatives had previously enacted. So a little bit of change potentially in the non-domicile arena. The Conservatives again had at the last moment a few months ago basically abolished the non-domicile regime with the intention of replacing it with something different from the 6th of April of next year. So it looks like Labour have broadly said they're going to stick to that, but of course we don't know the detail of how they're going to change the regime. Now, the relevance of that for employers is for those who have globally mobile employees. So if you're recruiting individuals into the UK, or they're being seconded into the UK from an overseas jurisdiction, if those individuals are non-domiciled, which there are lots of tests for that, but broadly, their permanent home is overseas, they were born overseas and are going to return overseas generally, then those individuals can normally claim what's called overseas work days relief. And that means they can claim relief on the days that they work outside of the UK in the first 3 years of their residence here. You might see that on payroll via what we call Section 690 directions, which enable the proration of pay as you earn to take into account the fact that these individuals can get relief on days they work outside the UK. So what we're hoping is, across the industry, that the abolition of the non-domicile regime should not, fingers crossed, mean the abolition of that overseas work days relief. Indeed, the Tories had that baked into their plan for next year, and I think the assumption is at the moment that Labour will also do the same. But we'll have to look at the detail of that when it arises. So that's the brief bit on the election. The next bit I just wanted, there's been another high-profile IR35 case, which you may have seen in the news with Adrian Chiles, the TV presenter. And I wanted to flag that again because it's, whilst clearly HMRC have got it in for celebrities and are going hell for leather for celebrities who are using personal service companies to provide their services. I think there are some it does highlight an important point for employers. So for those who are unfamiliar, IR35 is that regime whereby an individual engages with a company via their personal service company. And then there comes the question, is that individual actually an employee for tax purposes, or are they self-employed? And that is important, because if they're employed, then unless you're exempt, we won't go through the exemptions today, but unless you're exempt, then you as the engaging client will have responsibility for operating pay-as-you-earn and NIC, even if you're engaging with them through their personal service company. So what this Childs case highlights really is just how complex assessing employment status can be in some cases. Now, we have the check employment for status for tax on the HMRC website, and that can solve most cases. But there are a huge rump of cases in the middle which are neither employed or self-employed, or the CES tool can't decide. So what happens is basically you have to rely on case law, then the root case law, to work out what somebody's employment status is. Now, in the Childs case, even the courts have been unable to agree what the correct technical position is, whether he should have been deemed an employee or self-employed. And that's not the first time that this has happened with IR35. And this case law is very nuanced. I watched one debate, it went on for 3 hours just on one single aspect of determining employment status. So it highlights the fact that whilst the CES tool's useful and can determine employment status in many cases, it itself is based on case law. So if you get the inputs wrong to it, HMRC can argue that you can't rely on the outputs. Secondly, in many cases, if you might find that the CES tool doesn't actually give you a definitive answer either way, and then you've got to go back to the case law yourself and the test to work out whether somebody's employed or self-employed. Very important if you're a business which engages lots of contractors, but equally only one or two can create a real problem where you get the employment status wrong. So what I'm pushing for, and many across the industry, is for a statutory test. So some rules to be put in legislation which says black and white, if you meet these tests, you're employed. If you meet these tests, you're self-employed. They said it couldn't be done with residence, and we had the statutory residence test put into law in 2013. It works. Yeah, it's not perfect, but it's much better, in my view, than what went before, which was reliant upon interpretation. I think the same is needed for assessing employment status. But with the many things that the new government has to do, it remains to be seen, really, if anything will change, at least in the short term, in that area. As an employer and payroll, I would say, it is obviously you're going to be mostly concerned with who is on your payroll. But in an organization, I think payroll and more widely HR play a really important role in pointing out to the organization that and your wider company that there must be a process in place for determining the employment status for people who are engaged by their personal service companies or just engaged directly as contractors. Finally, a brief bit on the National Audit Office report on HMRC, which came out in recent months. Susan Ball made some interesting commentary from RSM, which was that which she pulled, I think, from the report, that people spent a staggering 7 million hours on the phone to HMRC between 22 and 23. That's the equivalent of 798 years, apparently. So this point about HMRC, which we've been talking about now for 3 years, and HMRC say they're making improvements, moving towards digitalization to make things more efficient. Taxpayers, and I'm sure you are seeing this as well, where you have to interact with HMRC, are not finding that the service is quick, the telephone lines are too slow, and crucially, I think, in some of the areas that we deal with, HMRC seem ill-equipped to deal with complex areas, and that can create real problems, because if they can't deal with complex areas, then where do you turn other than take advice, which comes with a cost, etc. So yeah, a lot of work still to do with HMRC. In the area of global mobility, as I always say, it's really important, therefore, to plan ahead and not assume that you're going to be able to get things like, for example, no tax codes through quickly, because the experiences that HMRC are still, unfortunately, taking a long time to process. Okay, that's all I wanted to cover today. Now I'm going to hand over to Jo, if you're still there.
I certainly am, Lee. Yes, thank
Excellent.
you very much indeed. Great stuff. So hopefully, fingers crossed, I'm just kind of moving through the slides itself. Again, apologies for the technical issues. But yeah, thanks very much, Lee, for the update. So normally, of course, in this section, we cover off the employer bulletin, don't we? But we've not had one. As Mel said, we didn't do a presentation last month, and the last update we'd had was from March. So what we thought, because it's the season, of course, let's take a look at P11Ds. So that's what I'm going to work through, of course. It's just around the corner. We've got the 6th of July deadline, of course. So we just thought we'd kind of work through the things to be aware of as far as expenses and benefits are concerned. So hopefully now on the screen, fingers crossed, you can see how do we report expenses and benefits, because it's a good question, isn't it? So in the last session that we covered off, we talked about payrolling of benefits, didn't we? We talked about the mandatory requirement, of course, from April 2026. So at the moment, for the current tax year, of course, 24-25, it's a voluntary option. So if you've volunteered already, you've missed the deadline if you haven't done it. If you need to register your interest to be able to volunteer to payroll your benefits. So if you've done that already, then that could be how you're taxing your employee for this current tax year. For the previous tax year, if you've done it last year, that's fine, that's great. You've nothing else to worry about apart from the P11DB. But of course, you still have to deal with the P11Ds from last year if you didn't payroll them. So P11D is the traditional version. We've always done it, haven't we? Since, believe it or not, it was around the mid-1970s when P11D and P9D came on board, of course, this post-tax year process. At the end of the tax year, we declare to HMRC, of course, the Inland Revenue, what benefits were provided to our employees, those taxable benefits. And of course, then we know, of course, that the back of that, HMRC will start to manipulate the tax code. Yeah, they adjust the tax code to get the tax back from the employee. And that's where we in payroll end up, of course, with all these tax code changes. So that process, as we know, as already talked about, is, again, to modernise this, to simplify this. They're going to move this on to payrolling of benefits as a mandatory requirement. But here now, of course, it's here for the next few years. If you still want to do P11Ds, that's absolutely fine. So now's the time. If you've not been doing the work already, get started. It's just around the corner, because of course you've got to gather the information, and sometimes that's half the battle, depending on what types of benefits, to even know what benefits we're providing to our employees, because if they're taxable, we've got to report them, of course. It's getting all of that information together. I try to then use June, because we are in June now, of course, the 18th of June, but try and use June to kind of create the P11D itself, so whether it's just if it's manually dealing with this, it's calculating what those benefit values are. If you're using a commercial software, great stuff, hopefully sending out maybe even a draft P11D to your employees so they can see. What we're trying to do here is allow them to see the P11D, the data, and query it with us before we send it to HMRC. That's what we're trying to do. So I try to use June as that month to do that. So I usually say to employees, come back to me by the end of June, the 30th of June. If any queries, we'll deal with them before the submission. But after that date, then it's on its way to HMRC, and that guarantees us, hopefully, to hit that submission deadline date of the 6th of July. So that's what we're going to work through, of course, this post-year process. We've already talked about payrolling of benefits. I won't talk about that anymore. But your other option, I just wanted to talk about this. This is the PSA, the PAYE settlement agreement. It's been around, of course, for many years, hasn't it? And it's where, kind of high level, it's where the employer kind of agrees, has an agreement with HMRC where they can provide certain items, benefits, expenses to their employees, and the employer picks up the tax and national insurance. Now, these have always been kind of restricted to a certain extent. The items had to be, minor, impractical, irregular, that kind of thing. I don't know whether I'm seeing a bit of a relaxation a little bit on this, because I have noticed, and I've just done this for a client as well, they managed to put through their private medical insurance on their PSA. Now, again, traditionally, I was never under the impression that they would permit things like that, but they seem to be doing so. So that could be something to look into. They're expensive, guys. That's the only thing. The employer is picking up the tax on the tax, and then, of course, 13.8 Class 1B national insurance. But that might be an option for you. Again, thinking about this mandatory payrolling of benefits. Anyway, those are our options, of course. If we have provided taxable benefits, expenses to our employees, we've got to report them to HMRC, and these are our options really moving forward. So think we've covered payrolling of benefits. Let's think about, of course, P11Ds. How does this work? Well, of course, the first thing was this kind of shock announcement. I think we mentioned it last year as well, where HMRC, via the employer bulletin in February last year, said they weren't accepting paper anymore. We've always done paper, haven't we? Certainly if you've got a handful of P11Ds, it was really kind of quite useful to a certain extent, fill them in and post them off. But of course, in 22-23 tax year, they said they wouldn't accept paper copies. And indeed, anybody who did provide a paper copy, they got it posted back to them and told them to, submit it online. So it is online only. That is the thing. And of course, it remains in play now for the last tax year, 23-24. So what are our options? Well, similar to last year, to be fair, you've got commercial software, which I'm going to talk about a little bit over on the next slide. So commercial software is an option for you if you want to do this as a business. My view tends to be if you've got, quite a number of P11Ds that you're having to deal with, then it might be worthwhile looking at the commercial software, because your other option for submission is, of course, HMRC's online services, which is fine. It's going to do the job. And as it says, can submit up to 500 P11Ds. But golly gee, there is no import facility on the online services. That's what I'm going to walk us through, of course, over the next few slides. So there are pros and cons. Your commercial software will do a lot. It will do, as we said, potentially just importing data from a CSV file. It will, I've just mentioned, of course, maybe emailing out the P11D certificate to the employee, PDF, maybe password protected, might even have an all singing, all dancing employee self-service solution where, of course, the employee can view the P11D there. So commercial products are great, and of course, they're going to do the calculations for you. Put the data in and it'll work out exactly what the cash equivalent value is, but they will come at a price. And that's where you have to work out as a business the cost of this, because although the HMRC services is free, it's not going to charge us anything for these submissions. It's the time it takes to create them and to do all of this work. So that's the thing I want you to help you compare over the next few slides. The other thing which I'm going to walk through as well is the amendments. So even if you're using commercial software, if you make a mistake, so let's say you've done your commercial software, 6th of July has come, you've sent your submission, you've hit the deadline date, then maybe days, weeks, months afterwards, you realise something's wrong, you've made a mistake down the line. The only way to fix that is through HMRC's online services. So we amend the P11D and potentially the P11DB there as well. So that's how we deal with the amendments, okay? But I'm going to walk through each of these processes. So the first one, the commercial products, I can't tell you which one to use. Of course, it's really going to be down to your business, and what you require as a business. But my advice is maybe start with this. This might be a good option. This is the Gov website. Now, some of you may have already seen this. And typically, we kind of come onto here to think when we think about payroll software. So payroll software usually has like a recognition with HMRC. It can submit data and receive information via RTI. But they also have listed on here P11D products. So again, if you feel that they're needed, or if you feel like you need to look into this, that would be my starting point. There's a long, long list. Have a look through, make contact with them. Of course, I know we're running out of time slightly, but make contact with them. So I'd start with that if you do need guidance. Hopefully you've already got things in play though, and you've already made the decision. If you haven't got commercial software and you think, well, I've only got half a dozen or a dozen or whatever it may be, then this might be a better option because it's free, isn't it? Certainly if you were doing paper copy previously, then of course this is your good alternative. So on here is the business tax account. So first of all, this is the first thing, you need to have access to it. So if you are the one responsible for processing the P11Ds, if you are using the business tax account, you're going to need a username and password. So again, that's as part of the business decision on how they're going to manage that. You can control this user access as well. So you can say, well, this particular user just needs access to the PAYE area. And again, in payroll, hopefully we've got access to that as well. But in here is the PAYE section. So this is me logged on as an agent. Agents can access this as well if that's a preferred method. So within the PAYE section, what you normally see on here is this annual statement, isn't it? So it's how much we owe HMRC. So as we submit our RTI data, it's gathering that information and telling us how much we owe them ultimately. So hopefully we're familiar with this area. But it's down here, of course. Now on the screenshot itself, the screen's a bit bigger than what we've got on the PowerPoint. So this, although it looks as if it's at the bottom, it's kind of in the middle. But you'll see that where it says, of course, just there on the right-hand side, it explains that it's expenses and benefit forms. So there's a couple of things to point out. Last time we were on, we talked about payrolling of benefits. If you want to register, this is including agents. If you want to register your clients to payroll their benefits from next tax year, you can now do that for them. The link is there within the business tax account. The arrow where it's pointing, of course, that's where we're going to go. Now I'm going to kind of walk us through the next few steps. So this is where we can submit the P11D and the P11DB. And if you have them, maybe company cars, this is the P46 car. So this is the like an interim P11D is the P46 car. So it's where we have, I don't know, you might have an employee who's never had a company car. Now you've given them a company car. Tell HMRC about it. They will amend the tax code in theory in real time. So it's during the tax year itself. So quite useful. The amended options are also there as well, of course. So if we do need to amend a P11D afterwards, after we've sent the submission, it's all within this option, okay? So all from that PAYE in the business tax account. So once we select that area, what happens then? Well, it depends. Okay, so the first thing to hit on here is whether or not you've used this function before. So for me, I've used this for the last couple of years for a couple of my clients. And again, just 1 or 2 P11D submitted. If you've used this before, and maybe colleagues have used this before, if you have you'll already have those employees listed. So if you used this last year, those employees you submitted for last year will still be there. So in which case you might need to just do a bit of a tidy up, you know, remove the ones that have gone maybe, or add the ones that are maybe new starters, for example. If you've never used it before for whatever reason, then that's part of the task. You're maintaining this list. So it's a similar view to what we have with commercial software, but of course it's all manual. Commercial stuff will probably have as I said, those import facilities. This is very manual. So again, that's why I keep talking about the numbers that you're dealing with. So we enter the employee information, first of all, fairly easy. Again, the feedback I received from delegates, you know, kind of the start of this year was they used it for 22-23 tax year submissions and they found it quite easy to use. So fingers crossed, that's what I'm going to try and get across in this session as well. So once we've done that, okay, we've got a list of our employees. My process then has been to kind of select the employee. Once you select the employee, you then have options, actions that you can take as far as each employee is concerned. Now, as you can see, I've kind of taken out my client's name. So you probably have the employer name, your PAYE reference, and you can see where you are clearly because you've got the employee's name and their national insurance number. So hopefully not kind of getting lost as to where you are, although it can be quite difficult with the online services. So for my client, of course, for my employee, my option is to submit the P11D. They haven't got a company car, so that's not available for me at this stage. However, of course, it's the P11D that I need to submit. Now, for my client, just to give you a heads up, it's a van, it's a company van that they have. So that's the process I'm going to work through, but kind of step by step, what are we dealing with? So I'm going to select the expenses and benefits. Is the first thing. So again, it confirms the employee, it confirms it's the P11D that I'm submitting here. So I've got all of that information and the famous green buttons. To start the process, we press the next button. And it's at that stage where it becomes maybe hopefully familiar with something that we, of course, that traditional P11D form. It's quite a long one. You've got to use a scroll on this, certainly on my screen. So there are 14 sections here. There are 14 sections of the P11D, of course. Just kind of plain black and white text really. I've had to put this just over on one side, but it's just to explain they are all there, they are all listed. So just as we have with that traditional P11D, again, even if you're using commercial software, it's going to be the same process. You select the section that's relevant to the benefit that you've provided. Now, it's giving you some hints and tips on here as well. It's talking about loans. So if you offer loans to your employees, again, as long as the loan or the loans never go over £10,000 during the tax year, there's nothing to report. But if it does exceed, that's where the taxable benefit comes on board, of course. So what I've done is just kind of taken a similar view to what we've just seen there on the screenshot, but maybe made it a little bit more user friendly. Because the other thing we need to point out, when we think about P11Ds, when we think about benefits, we think about the tax and the employee paying tax on each of these benefits. But don't forget the national insurance, of course, it's still there. Now, this is where I talk about blue boxes and brown boxes, because on that old traditional P11D, because HMRC are not making it anymore, it's gone, they won't make it anymore. So this is the old traditional view. Now, the majority of these boxes, as you can see, a nice brown colour, they are a Class 1A national insurance benefit. So the majority of benefits we generally offer to our employees, the employee pays tax and it's the employer who pays the national insurance. And of course, they do that by the 22nd of July. So those are the brown boxes. For the majority, that's the case. However, please be aware you have a couple of sections which are blue boxes. Now, the blue boxes are a Class 1 national insurance, and it simply means, unfortunately, as we know, Class 1 is what goes through payroll. It affects the payroll team. So a Class 1 national insurance, unfortunately, is where the employee and the employer pay national insurance, because as far as HMRC are concerned, you've as good as given them cash. So not only do they want the tax, they want the NI as well, unfortunately. So this is the bit where we need to try and capture it in real time. So as you're providing that particular benefit, whether it's vouchers or whatever it may be, we need to tell payroll for that pay period so we can try and get it in the payroll in real time. So just have an awareness of those 14 sections, of course. For me, I did give you a heads up, of course. For me, I selected vans for my client. They have a company van. So it's a set value. So this is really quite interesting because it's just a set value. So even this for the whole tax year, it doesn't populate anything. So it's equivalent to paper, literally. You've got to just type in the figures. So the client for me had the van for the whole tax year. Again, if it was part of the tax year, we can reduce it down using that 366 calculation. Remember, February was a leap year. So it's a 366 calculation. But of course, it's just a set amount. They had it for the whole tax year. So hopefully kind of a nice and easy one just to work through. You kind of continue on with this and you press the next button so you can add more benefits to that employee. You can, of course, find another employee and start to add in their benefits. Or for me, just as the case was, I selected then the P11DB. So this is, if you like, the employer's declaration. And of course, it's where we're confirming that these are all the benefits we provided to our employees. So once you move on to that section, then it confirms again, if you are an agent, which client you're dealing with, where you are. So you've got this confirmation throughout, and it just gives you this kind of introduction. What are we dealing with? So what is the Class 1A national insurance? When does it need to be submitted? And of course, when it needs to be paid by as well. So a little introduction as far as the P11DB is concerned. But once we go beyond that, we then need, and this is quite useful, to be fair. This is just a summary of the P11Ds that you've entered. So the total amounts of the P11Ds you've entered. So that's useful because I've been saying to people, if you are using this, try use spreadsheets or something just to have a note of the employees, of course, their national insurance number and details, but the cash equivalent value for each of their benefits, because Excel, as we know, can kind of do that quick calculation for us to summarize all of this. So it's good to see that it's there. At least it kind of gives us a summary. Because once you go into the P11DB, it's blank. There is nothing there. It doesn't pull the data through. And this is for a few reasons, really. I suppose it's making us check the figures. Also, again, if it was paper, you'd be filling in on paper. The other thing is payrolling of benefits. If you did payroll your benefits in tax year 23-24, you've dealt with the tax, but the national insurance still needs to be paid. And of course, even if you are payrolling your benefits, there's no P11Ds, you still have to complete the P11DB. So you're still coming into this area. So this is a total of not just what you've entered as far as P11Ds are concerned, it's also including, or you need to add on, any payroll benefits as well, of course, and the national insurance that's due. So when we finally do get to this kind of bottom bit here where it can go to, jumped ahead a bit there, where it can go to, of course, calculate the national insurance. In fact, I've just jumped ahead. There we go, fabulous. So that's the employees themselves. That's that one. So this is where we enter the data. So we've entered the data, the total of our benefits, what we provided to our employees. So when you press this calculate at the bottom, it simply takes what you've entered into this kind of top figure here, the total benefits of Class 1A benefits provided, and it will times it by 13.8%. And that's kind of it. That's kind of all it's doing. So eventually, of course, then we start to work through those next buttons, going through the submission. But before you send the submission, you have an option to review. So you can review the P11DB. You can review the P11s that have been completed so far as well. You can take all of those on as a review beforehand. So these might be quite useful if you want to, of course, show these to your employees, if you want to maybe share some of this with the employees before the submission's sent. It's entirely up to you, of course, but it might just stop some of those amendments having to be dealt with later on. Finally, again, once we are ready to do the submission, it's fairly easy. It's not too bad. You go through the declaration, you tick the boxes, of course, we press the green next button, and then it'll start to work its way through the submission. So the first thing it's going to do is ask for that same username and password, which is why I said you need access to the government gateway in order to do this. Once we've gone through that, that'll confirm the submission has all been sent through for us. And then, of course, we can start to go back. So you've got a few options on how you can do this. So you can either go right back to the beginning, find your employees, and then, of course, select their expenses and benefits, and it will then give you an option to view, print your submitted forms. But it confirms the date of when the submission has been sent. So that's quite useful for us as well. So that's for, in this example, I've selected the employee. We're going into their record, we're selecting the expenses and benefits and what's been submitted. So we see that same company van, the same details. And this is what we provide to the employee. Nothing wrong with it, but it's nothing like the traditional version, is it? It's just a summary. It's just a summary of the data you've entered, but it's completely valid. It's fine to give to the employee and their accountant for things like self-assessment. All absolutely fine. Your other one, of course, that we want is the P11DB, isn't it? So it's the same thing. We go through to view those and print those the submitted files, and then this is your P11DB. So absolutely fine to keep on file, or of course, if you're doing this for a client, to send across to the employer ready for payment. So that's it. So if that's all you're dealing with, that's all we have to cope with. That's perfect. Your other thing to bear in mind, though, is those amendments. So just as you add that on that opening screen, if you need to make an amendment, if you made a mistake, go on to first of all, the P11D. The way I've done it, I've selected the employee and then gone through the process, of course, working out what the amendment is. The advice here is the same, and it's been in the employer bulletins throughout, is this is going to completely override the original P11D. So if you had, for example, an employee who had a company car and a private medical, but you realised, I don't know, for whatever reason, the private medical value was incorrect, when you deal with the amendment, you would still note down the company car. You still need to note it on there, because this is going to completely override the original. And with that, of course, if you override the original, if it's a Class 1A national insurance benefit, the P11DB will also need to be amended. And it's the same thing. You are completely overriding the original submission. So just bear that in mind. This is going back to previous tax years as well. So it's all of them that are valid with this, okay? So just have an awareness of any amendments, which is why I say, if you can, try and deal with those queries beforehand. Fairly quick there, Mel. 4 minutes over, Mel, not too bad.
Don't worry. I think, well, it's just a lot to think about, isn't there, really? And then we'll see what happens in a couple of months' time after the election.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. As Lee said, I completely agree. I've heard exactly the same thing. I think the opposition are in for a good chance of getting in here. But I think what we've been told over the last few years, since November 2022, I think they're going to just continue with this freeze. From a payroll point of view, I think that is what will happen.
But never hold your breath.
No. What we tell you today is what we know today.
All right, well, thanks so much, Jo. If anybody wants to contact you, they can do via LinkedIn or via myself. Thank you to everyone that's joined us. Jo, you do such a great summary in such a short time, so thank you so much. and we'll see you all soon. Take care, everyone.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.